Welcome back to our channel, where we bring you the most gripping, heartbreaking, and dramatic developments from your favorite daytime television dramas. Today, we are diving into a storyline that will forever alter the landscape of Los Angeles, leaving a permanent scar on the canvas and shattering families beyond repair. The neon lights of the bikini bar flickered against the condensation of a half-empty glass, casting long, distorted shadows across the counter. While Spencer sat isolated in the dim corner of the establishment, his posture slumped and his spirit entirely broken. The crushing weight of Electra Forrester's absolute rejection echoed relentlessly in his mind. She had looked at him with such disgust, such finality, tossing her necklace at him and walking out of his life to align herself with R.J. Forrester. The betrayal stung worse than any physical blow he had ever endured. Will had tried to be the honorable man, trying to protect the corporate secrets of Logan Creations while desperately trying to hold onto the woman he loved. But the Spencer and Forrester feud was a toxic vortex, and it had finally swallowed his relationship whole. To numb the agonizing emotional pain, Will had turned to the one temporary solace he could find: alcohol. Glass after glass, he tried to drown the memories of Electra's departure, unaware that a far more insidious and deadly threat was silently ticking away inside his own head. Days prior, the tension between the younger generation had exploded into a violent physical brawl at this very bar. R.J. Forrester, fueled by jealousy and a misplaced sense of family loyalty, had aggressively grabbed Will's collar. In the ensuing chaos, punches were thrown, and R.J. had landed several brutal blows to Will's head and face before the tragic moment when Eric Forrester stepped in and accidentally took a punch. While the entire family focused on Eric's black eye and the scandalous PR nightmare it caused, no one paid attention to the physical toll the fight had taken on Will. The blunt force trauma from R.J.'s fists had done more than just bruise Will's skin. It had caused a microscopic fracture in his skull and severely weakened a vital blood vessel deep within his brain. It was a microscopic time bomb, a silent killer waiting for the perfect moment to detonate. The heavy consumption of alcohol at the bikini bar only exacerbated the hidden condition, elevating his blood pressure and thinning his blood, pushing the damaged vessel to its absolute breaking point. Stumbling out of the bikini bar into the cool, unforgiving night air of Los Angeles, Will felt a strange, throbbing sensation at the base of his skull. He dismissed it as a combination of the liquor and the profound exhaustion of his broken heart. Every step toward his beach house felt like wading through thick mud. The ocean breeze, usually a source of comfort, felt cold and biting against his flushed skin. His vision blurred slightly at the edges, but he attributed it to the tears of frustration that threatened to spill. He just wanted to get home, to collapse onto his bed, and to forget the disastrous turn his life had taken. He wanted to forget the disappointed look on Katie's face, the ruthless expectations of his father, Bill Spencer, and the crushing reality that Electra was currently seeking comfort in the arms of the very man who had helped destroy their relationship. Will finally reached the beach house, fumbling with his keys before pushing the heavy wooden door open. The silence of the empty house was deafening, a stark reminder of his profound isolation. He barely had time to kick off his shoes when his cell phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed with the name Melissa Dillon. Dillon had been relentless in her pursuit, calculating and opportunistic, waiting in the wings to capitalize on his vulnerability. Will answered the phone, his voice slurred and heavy with exhaustion. Dillon's voice on the other end was a mixture of feigned concern and manipulative affection, pressing him about his emotional state, trying to secure her position as his rebound romance. Will, agitated and overwhelmed, began to argue with her, his voice rising in frustration. He paced the hardwood floor, telling Dillon that he just needed to be left alone, that the corporate secrets and the romantic entanglements were suffocating him. And then it happened. It was not a gradual fade, but a sudden, catastrophic explosion of agony. Will stopped dead in his tracks as a blinding, white-hot pain seared through the center of his brain. It was a headache of unimaginable proportions, a thunderclap of agony that forced the breath from his lungs. The microfracture had given way, and the weakened blood vessel ruptured completely, sending a massive wave of arterial blood flooding into the delicate tissues of his brain. Will dropped the phone, the device clattering against the floorboards as Dylan's voice continued to call out his name in confusion. Will's hands flew to his head, his knees buckling instantly beneath him. He didn't even have the time to cry out for help before darkness violently overtook his consciousness. He collapsed heavily onto the floor, his body going completely limp as the massive brain hemorrhage began to shut down his vital organs one by one. Hours later, the front door of the beach house swung open. Bill Spencer and Katie Logan had been frantically trying to reach their son. Katie's maternal instincts had been screaming that something was terribly wrong ever since she heard about his drunken state at the bikini bar. Bill, trying to remain the stoic patriarch, had driven them to the beach house to give Will a piece of his mind and to pull him out of his depressive spiral. But the sight that greeted them in the living room would shatter their world into a million irreparable pieces. Will lay motionless on the floor, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing dangerously shallow and erratic. Katie let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed over the crashing waves outside, dropping to her knees beside her youngest son. Bill's heart stopped in his chest. The ruthless billionaire, the man who controlled empires, was instantly reduced to a terrified father. He scrambled to Will's side, shaking his shoulders, desperately screaming his name, but Will remained trapped in a deep, impenetrable coma. The frantic call to 911 was a blur of panic and terror. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their faces grim as they assessed the catastrophic neurological signs. Will was intubated on the living room floor, the rhythmic pumping of the manual resuscitator the only sound breaking Katie's hysterical sobs. The ambulance ride to the hospital was an agonizing nightmare. Bill held his son's cold hand, his mind racing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities, praying to a God he rarely acknowledged to spare his boy's life. Upon arrival at the emergency room, Will was immediately rushed into a CT scanner. The neurosurgeons delivered the devastating news to Bill and Katie with heavy hearts. Will had suffered a massive, catastrophic subarachnoid hemorrhage. The pressure in his skull was immense, and the brain damage was already extensive. He was on full life support, but his neurological activity was fading fast. They needed a miracle, and they needed the best trauma surgeon available. Thousands of miles away, on the glamorous shores of Monaco, Dr. John Finnegan was in the midst of his own personal nightmare. Steffy had just thrown her wedding ring at him and fled on a commercial flight back to Los Angeles, utterly disgusted by his inability to fully condemn his biological mother, Sheila Carter. Finn was standing on the beach, paralyzed by the collapse of his marriage, when his phone rang with an emergency international medical override. It was the chief of surgery in Los Angeles. The words that came through the receiver chilled Finn to his very core. Will Spencer, his brother-in-law Liam's younger brother, was brain dead, suffering from a massive hemorrhage, and the surgical team needed Finn's unparalleled expertise to attempt a highly experimental decompression procedure. Finn's personal marital crisis evaporated instantly in the face of this life-or-death medical emergency. Finn sprinted to the nearest transportation, utilizing every ounce of his wealth and influence to charter a private medical jet back to Los Angeles. The flight across the Atlantic was the longest, most agonizing journey of Finn's life. Hooked up to the hospital's secure servers via satellite Wi-Fi, Finn continuously monitored Will's real-time neurological scans. With every passing hour, the swelling in Will's brain increased, pushing the vital brainstem closer to herniation. Finn barked orders to the surgical team in LA, trying to manage the intracranial pressure remotely, but he knew the grim reality of medicine. Tom was brain, and Will was running out of both. Finn sat in the plush leather seat of the jet, his head in his hands, praying that he could make it back in time to save the young man's life, knowing the devastating impact this loss would have on the entire Spencer and Logan families. Back at the hospital in Los Angeles, the waiting room was a suffocating tomb of despair. Katie was inconsolable, weeping violently into the arms of her sister, Brooke, who had rushed to the hospital despite their recent, bitter estrangement. The sight of her nephew clinging to life on a ventilator temporarily paused the vicious corporate war between Logan and Forrester. Bill paced the hallway like a caged, wounded beast, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. He demanded updates every 5 minutes, threatening to buy the hospital and fire every doctor if they didn't fix his son. But all the money in the Spencer empire could not buy a cure for a ruptured brain vessel. Liam and Wyatt arrived, their faces ashen, staring through the glass of the intensive care unit at their vibrant, strong younger brother, now reduced to a fragile shell surrounded by beeping monitors and a tangle of plastic tubes. When Finn finally burst through the doors of the intensive care unit, still wearing his travel clothes, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Bill grabbed Finn by the shoulders, his voice cracking with a vulnerability no one had ever seen. "Save him, Finn. You have to save my boy." Finn nodded grimly, scrubbing in and rushing into Will's room. But as Finn examined the latest scans and performed a thorough neurological assessment, the devastating truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The pupils were fixed and dilated. The corneal reflexes were absent. There was no spontaneous respiratory effort. The catastrophic bleed had caused irreversible brain death. Finn stepped out of the room, his medical mask pulled down, his eyes filled with profound sorrow. He looked at Bill and Katie, the silence stretching into an eternity before he finally spoke the words that would destroy their universe. "I'm so sorry. The hemorrhage was too massive. The damage to the brainstem is irreversible. Will is gone." The words hung in the sterile hospital air, heavy and final. Katie collapsed to the floor, a guttural, soul-tearing scream ripping from her throat. It was the sound of a mother's heart being physically torn from her chest. Brooke fell to her knees beside her sister, wrapping her arms around Katie as they wept in a puddle of unimaginable grief. Liam and Wyatt turned away, burying their faces in their hands as the realization washed over them. But it was Bill Spencer's reaction that was the most chilling. Bill did not fall. He did not scream. He stood completely frozen, staring through the glass at the monitor that now displayed a flat, green line. The profound, agonizing grief in Bill's eyes slowly, terrifyingly morphed into something else entirely. It morphed into a cold, dark, and unadulterated rage. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, the medical examiner performed a mandatory autopsy to determine the exact cause of the sudden hemorrhage in such a young, healthy man. The results were sent directly to Finn, who had to deliver the horrific context to the grieving parents. The rupture was not a random aneurysm. It was the direct result of recent, severe blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner found evidence of a microfracture and localized bruising on the brain that perfectly aligned with the timeline of the violent physical altercation at the bikini bar. The truth hit the room like a localized earthquake. Will hadn't just died. He had been killed. And the fatal blows had been delivered by the fists of R.J. Forrester. When Bill Spencer heard the medical examiner's conclusion, the last shred of his humanity evaporated. The ruthless, cutthroat titan known as Dollar Bill was resurrected, but this time, he was fueled by the blood of his murdered son. Bill stood in the center of the hospital waiting room, his voice dangerously quiet but echoing with a lethal promise. He looked directly at Ridge Forrester, who had come to the hospital to offer condolences, completely unaware of his own son's culpability. "Your son killed my boy," Bill hissed, the venom in his voice causing the temperature in the room to plummet. "RJ beat my son, and it caused his brain to bleed out. This wasn't an accident, Ridge. This was murder." Ridge stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. He tried to defend RJ, claiming it was a mutual fight, that RJ had only been defending his grandfather, Eric. But Bill was not interested in excuses or mitigating circumstances. "I am going to destroy your family," Bill vowed, stepping into Ridge's personal space, his eyes burning with a murderous intensity. "I am going to unleash every lawyer, every investigator, and every ounce of power I possess. I will see RJ in handcuffs. I will see him stripped of his freedom, his future, and his life. He is going to rot in a concrete cell for what he took from me. The Spencer-Forrester War is no longer about fashion or corporate espionage. It is about blood, and I will have my pound of flesh." The news of Will's death and the impending legal apocalypse sent shockwaves of sheer terror through the Forrester mansion. When RJ was informed that Will had died, and that the autopsy directly linked the death to his punches, the young designer collapsed in a panic attack. The reality of his actions crashed down upon him. He had only meant to defend his grandfather, to put Will in his place, to win Elektra's favor. He never intended to kill anyone. RJ wept uncontrollably, terrified of the prison sentence that now loomed over his head, terrified of the monstrous wrath of Bill Spencer that was currently hunting him down. Ridge immediately mobilized a team of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the country, realizing that he was no longer fighting for a fashion line, but for his son's very life. Elektra Forrester was completely shattered by the tragedy, consumed by a guilt so profound it threatened to break her mind. She had stood in that beach house and rejected Will, punishing him for corporate secrets, throwing her necklace at him, and leaving him to spiral into the drunken depression that ultimately masked his fatal symptoms. She had aligned herself with RJ, the man whose fists had actually caused Will's death. The horrifying irony was too much to bear. Elektra locked herself in her room, haunted by the memory of Will's desperate pleas for forgiveness, realizing too late that her stubborn pride and the toxic family rivalry had cost the man she truly loved his life. She was now trapped in a nightmare, caught between mourning the love of her life and watching the man she had chosen face a murder trial. As the sun set over Los Angeles, the city braced for the most brutal, unforgiving war it had ever seen. Bill Spencer was a man possessed, utilizing his media empire to drag RJ's name through the mud, painting him as a violent, unhinged killer. Subpoenas were filed, police investigations were launched, and the district attorney, heavily pressured by Spencer Publications, prepared to file charges of involuntary manslaughter, or worse. Katie Logan, trapped in a purgatory of grief, watched as the father of her child turned into an instrument of pure vengeance. The death of Will Spencer had permanently altered the canvas, proving that the petty rivalries and corporate betrayals had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. The blood of a Spencer had been spilled by a Forrester, and in the tragic, devastating aftermath, the only certainty was that the cycle of destruction was just beginning, and no one would survive the fallout unscathed.